understanding country in Canberra in particular is obviously dominated by, that very small little moss, the Bogong moss. And it's a story now that many people are really familiar with, but it's also a story now that we should rely on more and more because of that idea of this gathering, this natural gathering which occurs, which we can, in our way, seeing them as our kin, can feel connected to each other through. So this idea that we have a story which connects us to place, which connects us to people, is a really important message for the times we're living in. The process of working with the lights and projections is something new, and the idea of creating those designs and trying to make them work and make sense is something that which I haven't done before. So it was a really a fantastic opportunity to experiment and play within that space, and also think, I guess, more responsively around the issues that we're dealing with, and thinking about how these sort of more temporary artworks can help create a kind of language, and help create stories and help navigate people. One of the key issues that the work sort of also highlights is those issues around like environmentalism and, what's happening to country and the problems that are being created, and obviously those problems have led us to this moment with COVID outbreaks, those habitat destructions creating hotspots for pandemics to occur. And so that understanding country, understanding the way we're connected, understanding our relationship, our physical relationship and impact that we have is so important during these times. One of the really important processes of making the project was connecting with local community. We need that local knowledge, we need those local stories to inform us and to guide us. So the project has been really blessed to work with Aunty Matilda House, who has helped guide the project, but also just give us those enormous, that story, so give us permission, but also give us the stories and knowledge.
Collecting the bogong moths is something that it must have been a wonderful, wonderful sight to see because, when you get so many thousands of them, but when they were cooked, the rock was very, very, very big. They would then, the women would put all the wood and everything on that big rock, and it would burn and burn and burn until it got so hot you'd have to stand right away from it. And that's how after a couple of days, they'd wipe it clean, get all the ash and everything off, and then put the bogong moths on them. And no, they don't taste like chicken. They end up like little dry cashew nuts, I reckon, anyways, because that's how I tasted them.
Working with this process has been interesting. It's not a format I've worked with before, and so thinking about how to create a design and projecting it onto the floor to create these spaces for people. And we've been playing with different designs and different ways of working. Originally, I was hoping to work with a program that would help animate and sort of lay the moths down in a particular pattern. But it became more apparent that we actually need to work with them individually and lay each one of them by hand. And so that sort of, that pattern that we've been able to create is just slowly sitting down and manipulating each moth and sitting down with them, which I think is a really important, is an important way of understanding that process. There are these sort of individuals flocking together, and I think that process of how animals migrate, of how things move. I think it is important to remember that we still, as human beings, don't quite understand that. The way that animals connect, the way that this small, moth travels thousands of kilometres to come and migrate back and forth, not with living memory. There's no living memory there. It's actually a new generation every time. And so how an animal manages to do that is something that still, scientists have their guesses and they have their predictions of how that works, but we don't really know for sure. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, that we're still coming to terms with nature, and when we still don't understand nature, it's even more, I guess, urgent that we don't interfere with it.
You can become whatever you want to become, but please maintain your culture. Maintain that story of how the Bogong moths brought all this together. The Bogong moth is still speaking to us. You know, the running of the feast, the running to the feast.
Well, and I think the most humbling part of it all is it's through a tiny little insect. And I think that's the one thing that is amazing about Aboriginal culture, isn't it? That we're reminded of this enormous weight of history, this enormous cultural sort of story that talks to country, that speaks to leadership, is all represented in one little moth, one tiny little moth.
Yeah, well, it has brought so many people together, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. It was just like so long ago, 2006 or 8, was that, on the 42nd sitting of Parliament House, when all those people come down to hear Kevin Rudd say sorry. If you stood back from the top of the hill and looked down, you can actually see and vision how moths were on the rocks up there at Namaji. You know, thousands and thousands of people. And just like the walk across the bridge down in Sydney, you know, thousands were there as well. So, you know, Aboriginal people can keep that dream alive. And it's just like the Bogong moths of coming together, just like this beautiful design that you've done. I think it's so outstanding and it's so put together that I'm very proud to be part of it. And I will always be seeing yourself as being one of the greatest storytellers through your art, and I much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Thank you.